In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of food contaminants. So basically all the different ways that food can become unsafe. To begin with, we're going to talk about the most common ways that food becomes contaminated. The first source of contamination in food is animals, and that may seem a little strange. There are two ways that this happens. The first way is that we use certain animals for food. So things like chicken, beef, pork, they all have naturally occurring pathogens that are present in them. The next way that animals can contaminate food is through pests. So that's things like mice or bugs that come in contact with food, or the things that we use to cook food, like the utensils. The next way that food becomes contaminated is through people. And there's a few different ways that this happens. The first way is through poor personal hygiene. And that means exactly what you think it means. It means that you're not washing your hands and that you're not taking care of your clothing and things like that. The next way is through sneezing and coughing onto food. This means that people sneeze and cough onto food, and the germs that they are experiencing get passed directly into the food. The last way is through what they call fecal oral routes. And yes, that means what you think it means. And yes, those are two things that you never want to hear together. It's poop to mouth. And generally this happens through poor personal hygiene, not washing your hands, and then touching things that have been contaminated and then touching food. But this is something you never want to happen, but also happens quite often. Final way that food can become contaminated is through cross-contamination. And like we mentioned in part 1, cross-contamination is one type of food coming into contact with another type of food that it shouldn't. Generally, this has to do with raw foods like raw meats coming in contact with ready-to-eat foods like already prepared foods or produce, but cross-contamination can be a huge issue in the food service kitchen. So it's also important to discuss the different types of contamination. And there are 3 types, like we talked about in the previous chapter: biological, chemical, and physical. The first category is biological. And biological is going to be pathogens. These are things that make you sick. So one of the most important things to know about biological contamination is that the symptoms are pretty much the same if you're exposed to them. So those symptoms are vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, fever, cramps, and jaundice. Jaundice is only for hepatitis A, and that causes a yellowing of the skin and eyes. What that means is that it's caused by hepatitis A, which is a disease of your liver. And so because your body isn't filtering as well, then you end up with your eyes turning yellow and your skin turning yellow because toxins are building up in your body. The first place this shows up is in your eyes. So if you are a manager in food service and you see one of your employees show up and they have yellowing around the corners of their eyes, you definitely need to get that checked out, because if they have hepatitis A, that immediately becomes something that the press will be informed of, and anybody that eats at your establishment during the time period that that particular person is working is going to need to get a shot in order to prevent them from becoming ill. The other symptoms associated with foodborne illness pretty much read like a Pepto-Bismol commercial. So if you just think about the song they sing in that commercial, then you'll probably remember them. These are all the symptoms that you generally associate with a stomach bug or a stomach flu. So your next thing that we're going to talk about with contamination is the types of biological pathogens. So these are living things that can make you sick in food. The first is viruses. The things you need to know about viruses are that they transmit from people to food, and then food to people, and then also people to people. They have to have a living host to multiply, so they don't actually grow in food, but a very small number of them can make you sick, so there's still a huge concern. Not washing hands is the biggest culprit for spreading viruses, generally because people go to the bathroom, don't wash their hands, and then touch many surfaces on the way. You can catch a virus from any of the surfaces that a person who hasn't washed their hands has touched. Bacteria are already present in the food because of the animals that we use for food, or they're added in by humans. Bacteria multiply exponentially, so they end up being able to reproduce in the food and double every certain amount of time. The temperature that the food is held at determines how quickly those bacteria multiply. But as you can see, if you start with 2, and then shortly after you end up with 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, them growing ends up being a problem very quickly. Another type of biological contaminant is parasites. Parasites, like viruses, require a living host to grow, but they're much larger than viruses are. even though when you first take them in, they can be small enough that you can't see them. They're present in things like meats, especially game meats, and they're also present in water in some locations, although we generally don't struggle with them too much in the United States. The fourth category of biological contamination is fungi. And fungi are present in a lot of the foods that we eat. The things we see this in the most are yeast, mushrooms, and mold. And all of these things have their places in things like breads and cheeses. The naturally occurring ones are ones that generally don't cause us harm unless there's an allergy. But some yeast can become overgrown and spoil food, some mushrooms are toxic, and some molds are toxic and can cause allergy issues as well. The biggest thing with fungi is to understand that we want the ones that we want, and the ones that we don't, we need to avoid. Going a little more in depth to each of the categories, bacteria has some different considerations because it is capable of growing in food. It does, however, need specific characteristics in order to grow in food. So now we're going to review what characteristics bacteria need to grow. There are 6 conditions that bacteria need to grow, and they can be easily remembered with the acronym FAT-TOM. The first consideration with bacterial growth is food. Bacteria, just like us, need food. Unfortunately, we can't really control that. Because we need food and bacteria need food, at some level we're always going to be in competition with bacteria when it comes to preventing foodborne illness. Bacteria also prefer a certain level of acidity. Also, like us, they prefer it neutral to slightly acidic. We also can't control this factor because food either has an ideal acidity or it doesn't. The ideal acidity level for bacteria is right around 7. Any higher or lower in the pH scale and the bacteria is typically destroyed. There are 2 factors within FAT-TOM that we are able to control within the food service industry. The easy way to remember this is that they are the 2 T's within FAT-TOM, and they are temperature and time. We're going to cover these 2 together because they're pretty much linked. Temperature is a consideration because at certain temperatures, bacteria grows very well. The range at which it grows very well is the temperature range at which bacteria are most comfortable is between 41 and 135. Below that is refrigerator or freezer temperatures, and they're pretty much dormant at those temperatures and not reproducing. Above 135 is cooking temperatures, and above those temperatures they're typically destroyed. Within this temperature range, bacteria can grow, but within the range of 70 to 120, bacteria are very comfortable in reproducing rapidly. This temperature range, you want to avoid leaving foods out for very long. Unfortunately, this is also the temperature range for room temperature. So bacteria grow very rapidly at room temperature, which is why we try to keep things that are potentially dangerous in the refrigerator for as much time as possible. Time factors into both of these temperature ranges greatly. The reason for this is the temperature danger zone shortens the amount of time that it takes for the bacteria to double or exponentially grow. That range at which the bacteria grow more rapidly shortens it even more. So the amount of time that food is left out at a certain temperature can drastically change the amount of bacteria that's present, which can either make you grow sicker first, or if it's growing the bacteria to a higher level, it means that your immune system has virtually no chance of fending off those particular bacteria. At lower numbers, even if you're exposed to the small number of bacteria, most of the time it's not enough to actually make you sick. The next factor of FAT-TOM to consider is oxygen. Oxygen can affect bacteria in 2 different ways, because there are 2 different classifications of bacteria when it comes to oxygen. Some are what are called aerobic bacteria, meaning that they need oxygen in order to grow, or some even in order to exist, much like us. There are some bacteria, however, that are anaerobic bacteria. This means that if they're exposed to oxygen, they either can't grow or they die. An example of this is Clostridium botulinum, or botulism. This grows with no oxygen present, meaning that it grows well in things that are vacuum-packed or canned. Clostridium botulinum is especially dangerous because it produces a toxin. That toxin isn't destroyed by cooking temperatures. Therefore, once the Clostridium botulinum grows and produces a toxin, there's no way to make that food safe. The final element of FAT-TOM is moisture. This is measured in something called water content. Water has a water content of 1, and the measurement of how much water is present in a particular item is measured down to 0. Things with a water activity that are high, like meats and vegetables, can grow bacteria very quickly, but things with a low water activity, like crackers or bread, don't necessarily grow bacteria at all. Therefore, water activity and moisture have a huge impact on how well bacteria is able to exist and grow. With Fat Tom, the most important thing to consider is that bacteria are a lot like us. They have certain conditions at which they're comfortable, they have certain conditions at which they can survive and they're kind of hunkered down and not really doing anything, and they have certain conditions in which they thrive. Our goal with bacteria and food is to either kill it or prevent it from growing. So knowing these conditions and knowing how they interact with the different bacteria is extremely important. There are certain bacteria that we focus on more than others in the food service industry. The reason for this is that they're the ones that cause the most instances of illness. For each of these bacteria, there's one distinguishing thing that makes it stand out from the other bacteria. So, what I'm going to do is put a picture on the screen of what stands out about each of these bacteria. The first one is Salmonella typhi. Salmonella typhi is a little bit odd. It's not the one that we know that's associated with chicken and poultry and eggs and that kind of thing. Salmonella typhi is associated with beverages, so things like water, but the most important thing to know about this one is it can be carried by humans. If you're the type of person that likes looking up historical stories, look up Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary was a carrier of typhoid fever, and her chosen profession was cooking for families. She ended up killing a couple of the families that she worked for because at that point in time we didn't have antibiotics and ways to test for it. So she would bounce from town to town and work for families and didn't really understand that she was causing people harm. She ended up living out the rest of her life in quarantine. The next bacteria you need to know is Salmonella, and this is the one that we know and love. It's associated with poultry, so pretty much flightless birds, and it's killed at 165 degrees, which is why we see all of your chicken products, eggs, all those different things needing to be cooked to 165 degrees. Salmonella is naturally occurring in the intestinal tract of these birds. So generally you would think it wouldn't come into contact, but pretty much all of your turkey, chicken, and duck is going to be contaminated with this. This is why you never see, as you've seen pictures of on the internet, medium rare chicken. It's not safe. The next bacteria you need to know is Shigella. And the thing that stands out about this is it's carried by flies. This is a large part of the reason why we want to keep flies out of any restaurant. When you go into restaurants and feel that whoosh of air that hits you when you go in, and you also feel that at Walmart as well, that's designed to keep flies out of the establishment. Shigella is found in ready-to-eat food, and that's because these are things that are not going to be cooked before they go out, meaning that if it does have any flies on it or has been exposed to Shigella, then it won't end up being cooked out before the customer gets it. The next bacteria you need to know is E. coli, and you've probably already heard of this one. It's found in the intestinal tract of cattle. So often during processing, if it's not done correctly, E. coli from the intestinal tract can come in contact with the rest of the meat. For the most part, if you cook the outside of things like steaks or chops or roast, you're not going to be exposed to this. This becomes a bigger issue with ground beef, which is why you always hear to cook ground beef completely. In recent years, it's become a consideration with fruits and vegetables. We've seen a lot of recalls of fruits and vegetables based on E. coli exposure. And these are fruits and vegetables that aren't cooked, like lettuce and tomatoes for salads. This is probably due to runoff from cattle farms, but it's also an important consideration because E. coli illnesses can't be prevented if it's in something that you're not going to be cooking. E. coli is killed at a temperature of 155, which means that burgers that are cooked at that temperature are fine, but if food isn't cooked, the bacteria isn't killed, but it can still grow. Next category of biological contamination is viruses, and there's a few important things to understand about viruses. The first of which is that it's transferred onto food or transferred from person to person. It doesn't grow in food like bacteria does. That doesn't make it any less dangerous, however, because they're very easily transmissible. Part of the reason is that it travels through fecal-oral routes, which means, like I mentioned earlier, exactly what it sounds like, poop to mouth. And it comes from people not washing their hands and then touching surfaces. It comes from people washing their hands and then touching the surfaces that people haven't washed their hands have touched. There's a lot of different ways that this can happen. So a lot of times these types of things run rampant in places like daycare centers because hand washing isn't always available. The next thing that is important to understand about viruses is that they're not typically killed by cooking temperatures, which makes them a little more dangerous when it comes to transmission. So, if a person that has a virus prepares your food, there's a good chance that that particular virus may not be killed when that food is cooked. It is important to note, however, that viruses are typically associated with ready-to-eat foods, so foods that are not going to be cooked anymore until the customer eats them. There are two different viruses that are common in the food service industry that you need to know. The first of which is hepatitis A. Hepatitis A is associated with jaundice as its symptom. Jaundice is a yellowing of the skin and eyes, and this is caused because your liver isn't functioning properly, and so it's not filtering out the toxins in your body. If somebody on your staff has hepatitis A, you need to shut down immediately and notify the regulatory authority locally. Typically, anyone who's eaten at your establishment is going to need to get a vaccine, and any of the food that person is prepared needs to be thrown away. It's a very serious outbreak if you have one. The next virus that you need to understand is norovirus. And norovirus has all the common foodborne illness symptoms, and it gets passed on very easily. You'll often hear about it on the news as having an outbreak at daycare centers and schools because of the lack of hand washing that's able to be done at those levels. It spreads super easily, but a lot of times it just gets written off as a regular stomach virus. So some cases we don't even ever hear about. The next category of biological contamination that you need to know about is parasites. These aren't extremely common in the United States, but we do need to know a little bit about them. These need a host. They start very small, so obviously we don't know we're taking them in, but they can grow large to the point that they impede the function of your intestines or can cause an extreme amount of weight loss. Parasites are the reason that any fish or meat served raw should be frozen by the manufacturer. That freezing temperature is what kills the parasite to prevent it from being able to reproduce or grow in a person's system. The final category of biological contamination is fungi. And this one's a little bit confusing because a lot of the things that are fungi can be very good things within the right context and very bad things within the wrong one. The first one is yeast. Yeast can be used to rise bread, but it also spoils food by causing over-fermentation and changing the chemical composition of the food. The next one is mushrooms, and mushrooms can be toxic, which will either kill someone or have a pretty severe reaction. And then last of all, you have mold. And mold can be present in things like cheeses, and it adds different flavors and things, but it can be toxic or cause an allergic reaction. Another category of biological contamination is seafood toxins. Most of the time these are caused by bacteria, so they're not necessarily considered a fully separate category, but the issue with these is that the bacteria within seafood ends up reproducing, and as a byproduct of that, toxins are produced. Those toxins can't be cooked out, so once they're present, you're in bad shape. This is the reason that all seafood needs to be very carefully maintained with its temperature. Bacteria in seafood can reproduce those toxins very, very quickly. So that's the reason why time temperature abuse has to be avoided at all cost. Chemical contamination is your next category of contamination. And when it comes to chemical contamination, the most common culprit is going to be cleaners. So this is generally not going to be intentional. These are left behind when cleaning improperly, and they're also sometimes due to making things like sanitizer with too high a concentration so that it doesn't evaporate to a safe level. There's a few things that you need to know about chemical contamination. First of all, any of the chemicals that you use in food service need to be approved for food service use. This means you don't necessarily want to go to Walmart or Dollar General and pick up your cleaners. Food service cleaners are typically at a much lower concentration than household cleaners. Most household cleaners that we buy are disinfectants, which means they disinfect and kill viruses. What you need in food service is sanitizers, and sanitizers kill bacteria, but to prevent viruses in food service, you're generally going to be doing things like keeping sick people at home and making sure that people wash their hands. So in food service, all of your chemicals are going to come with safety data sheets. These are sheets that tell you the chemical composition, how to use them, and what to do if something goes wrong, like somebody ingests them or gets them in their eyes. You must keep these on hand for anything that you have that's a chemical in food service. All of your chemicals only need to be used as intended. Use cleaning for cleaning, sanitizers for sanitizers. You want to follow all your directions for your chemicals, and then any chemicals that are not in their original packaging, make sure that they are labeled clearly so that you know exactly what they are. And then check your safety data sheets for how to dispose of them. Some of them you can't just dump in the trash because they could be dangerous if they get out of bags or things like that. So being safe with your chemicals along the way is going to help a lot with making sure that chemical contamination does not happen. It's also important to note that things like soaps and lotions and medicine can cause chemical contamination, so it's important to be careful with these items while you're in the food service kitchen or in your kitchen at home. Physical contamination typically causes an injury and not an illness. It causes damage to either your esophagus or your stomach as it goes through your system. So things that can cause injury are pieces of jewelry, staples and paper clips or pieces of cartons like tape, pieces of cleaning materials like rags or sponges, and bandages can cause an issue as well. Bandages in the United Kingdom are actually required to be blue so that they don't blend in with food. You can also have issues with fingernails, either fake fingernails, clippings, or chips of nail polish. Metal shavings from cans can also be a problem because as you're opening them, you have those little pieces that come off. And then naturally occurring things like bones from fish can be an issue, or bone chips from different types of meat, or things like glass from broken light bulbs or dishes, so if they break and then get into the food. If you ever have a foodborne illness outbreak, there's a few things that are important to know. An outbreak is considered to be 2 or more people getting a foodborne illness from food that was identified to come from your establishment. 2 people may seem like a small number, but the reason for this is that if 2 people can think of the food that they ate at the point in time that it made them sick, chances are that there's others that may have become ill at that point in time. If you want to understand how hard it is to track down an outbreak, try to remember everything you've had to eat for the last 72 hours in detail, or even longer. Some illnesses take, if they're parasites, much longer to appear. So it's very difficult to track that down. Also, a lot of people write off foodborne illness symptoms as just a stomach flu, and so they don't actually report the illness. So, a foodborne illness outbreak counts as 2 or more people. The first thing you want to do if you have an outbreak or anyone tells you that they've gotten sick from eating at your establishment is to get contact info. This allows you to call them back if needed and to give that to the regulatory authority if needed. The second thing you want to do is notify your local regulatory authority. This is going to allow you to cooperate, and it's a lot better that they hear it from you than somebody else, because if you cooperate from the very beginning, then they're going to be a lot more willing to look for other sources of the outbreak. The outbreak might be something that can be linked to another product. So, whatever product that you think might have caused the issue, you want to separate that product out. That way, if it's something that came from the factory that way or came from your supplier that way, you're not going to have issues with that. You also want to identify any staff that might have had any sort of contact with the food that caused the illness. They might need to be sent home, they might be at risk of illness, and they might be the source of the illness, which means that you would need to segregate any product that they have. The next big thing we're going to talk about is allergies. And allergies are an immune response to a protein in food. The body, or the immune system, attacks the food and causes a reaction. Allergies and intolerances are often grouped together, and they both have serious reactions, and often the way that we react to them in the food service industry is exactly the same. But we're going to be talking about allergies for this particular section. The symptoms of allergies are a little bit different than foodborne illness symptoms. It can be things like hives and itching, respiratory symptoms like shortness of breath, sometimes even your throat will close shut, and that's called anaphylaxis, and that can be very life-threatening. Sometimes you end up with swelling, and then also on top of that, you have the typical foodborne illness symptoms of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and cramps. It's important to note that the respiratory symptoms can be very serious and cause death, so taking allergies seriously is extremely important. The most common allergies are known as the Big 8. These are the ones that statistically have the most people that have issues with them. Each of these particular things need to be identified on any labeling that you have, and sometimes it's a good idea to even do that on the menu or on cards in your establishment. The Big 8 are milk and dairy, eggs, fish, shellfish, wheat, soy, peanuts, and tree nuts. You, as a food service manager, are responsible for preventing allergic reactions in your establishment, and there are several ways to do this. The first is to be honest about ingredients. There are no secret ingredients when it comes to allergies. A secret ingredient can even cause death, so make sure that you know what your ingredients in your items are. The second is to speak with both the chef and the manager so that they can watch that food item throughout the entire process and make sure that no cross-contact happens. Any allergen coming into contact with a food that somebody who has an allergy is eating is called cross-contact. Next, you want to know your menu. By knowing your menu, you're able to suggest things that are simple that might be safe for those that have allergies. And finally, any food that you're preparing for anyone who has allergies needs to be prepared completely separately, and everything that comes in contact with that needs to be washed beforehand. Making sure that you're careful with each of these steps can help prevent most allergic reactions. Our last thing is some considerations to have when you're preparing food for somebody with an allergy. The first one to consider is fryer oil. Fryer oil can have things like fish and shellfish in it, and so make sure that the fryer oil that you're using hasn't had those in there, even if you're preparing things like French fries. The next thing is clean all your equipment, surfaces, and dishes before preparing that item for the person with the allergy. Wash your hands, change your gloves, wear a clean apron, anything you can do to prevent any cross-contact from happening. And then finally, any packaged items that you carry in your location, make sure that those are labeled with those big 8 on the label in addition to the ingredients. As you can tell, contamination is a huge consideration when it comes to cooking. Hopefully you learned a lot in terms of ways to prevent foodborne illness, allergies, and injuries in this video. Thanks for joining us.